Greetings, this is Bishop Michael Callahan with the Catholic Church in America and St. Anthony's Liturgical House of Studies. Thank you for joining me today. We will be talking about the legacy of Utrecht again. This is our fourth module, and it's entitled A Conciliar Church. A little background, though. In speaking about Old Catholics, we must often speak in generalities. This is because there's such a great deal of disparity in this particular genre of the church. The root cause, as I see it, is our independence. This is one of our warts, as I described back in Module 1, and it's the sin of pride. As I mentioned last week, it's also a huge factor in the disparity between various Old Catholic jurisdictions. Case in point, one of my consecrating bishops, and I'll withhold the name, was highly disappointed that our late Archbishop chose me to be his coadjutor and subsequently his successor. As a result, this man pridefully broke away from our communion and is unsuccessfully working to start something new. I say unsuccessfully because in his hardness of heart, he's run off priests, deacons, and parishioners, telling them that he is speaking as God and that nobody has any footing to question his actions. It's bishops like this, in my mind, who shun collegiality in favor of power and control, who give veracity to our naysayers. In their independence, they lose touch with the very fundamentals or the foundations of Catholicism in general and Old Catholicism in particular. Though they may affirm conservative values, they make a conscious decision to leave behind a central concept of Catholicism: collegiality, becoming something different. Episcopoi vagante. An episcopoi vagante is the term that describes many of these prideful bishops that seem, at least from outward appearances, to be highly self-serving, looking for personal aggrandizement, rather than becoming selfless servants, rather than working collaboratively with a college of bishops. Our continuity to what has gone on before is, or rather should be, the defining factor. The defining factor for how we move forward. This is why many of us within the conservative Old Catholic movement are seeking collegiality and intercommunion agreements. This is also why these connections are so important. Not for reasons of personal pride or garnering power and control, but rather so that we may maintain meaningful dialogue and collaboration among like-minded conservative jurisdictions. Central to the development of the early church is our conciliar roots. More often than not, when we hear discussions talking about conciliarism, it's in the context of the 13th to 14th century, when the Roman Church and papacy were embroiled in corruption and secular discord. As we've already covered in previous modules, and will look into in my upcoming class on the first 7 ecumenical councils, the primitive church was primarily synodical and council-driven. Rarely was the Bishop of Rome the prime mover, nor was his opinion necessarily the deciding factor in conciliar decisions. To the contrary, as I indicated in last week's module, though papal representatives were shown great deference and respect at the Sixth Ecumenical Council, the wishes of the Bishop of Rome were overruled in the end. So let's start off by looking at the post-apostolic period. And in particular, we'll start off with the Apostolic Council of Jerusalem. The Acts of the Apostles records, without using for it the term council or synod, what has been called the Council of Jerusalem, to respond to a consultation by Paul of Tarsus. The apostles and elders of the church in Jerusalem met to address the question of observance of biblical law in the early Christian community, which included Gentile converts, the rest of us. This is the only such meeting recorded in the New Testament, and may be referred also in the epistle to the Galatians. This meeting of the church in Jerusalem was not a gathering of representatives coming from all areas, like an ecumenical council. It is called the Apostolic Council because of the participation in it of the apostles. This gives it a character different from the normal pre-ecumenical councils of the church, and it took place around the year 50. And so it's our supposition that the early church took the Council of Jerusalem as an example, that when we have questions that aren't necessarily addressed in Scripture, that the leaders of the church should gather together in council or synod and hash out the details and come to a prayerful understanding of just what the Christian position should be on any one of these particular items. And so then we had what I refer to as normal pre-ecumenical councils before the gatherings of bishops from around the world to discuss items. In times of greater toleration, that is, when there wasn't great persecution of the church, Christian leaders at that time felt sufficiently secure to hold councils governing their see or metropolitan area. None of these councils of this period gathered representatives from all Christian churches or even from those throughout the Roman Empire. Only a few of them are written down and their acts preserved. Most are known only from accounts and works of the church historians and other writers. And I'll give a list of some of these. There was a council in Rome in 155 and also in 195, in Ephesus in 193, in Carthage at 251, Iconium in 258, Antioch 264, on and on, Arabia in 246, Elvira 306, another one in Carthage in 311. There was a synod of Caesarea 314, in Syra 314, and Arles in 314 as well. Councils such as these began to appear only in the middle of the 2nd century. At first, at the local level, but from 175 onward, they involved several communities coming together, with such activity particularly marked in Italy and Asia Minor. At the end of that century, it became a practice to inform other communities of the decisions taken at such assemblies. So therefore, in the 3rd century, the meetings began to be held at regular intervals, a custom that appeared in the first in the Roman province of Africa. In the second half of that century, councils were held at Antioch and gathered representatives from Christianity throughout the Middle East, from the Black Sea to Egypt. These assemblies were a prelude to the holding of the first assembly of all bishops at the First Council at Nicaea, the event that marked the end of the period of the pre-ecumenical councils. There were a great deal of topics, a range of topics discussed in these pre-ecumenical councils. The earliest known church councils were held in the mid-2nd century, and they condemned Montanism. One of these was held at Hierapolis and presided over by their local bishop and attended by 26 other bishops. Another council of 13 bishops was held at Anchialus under the presidency of the bishop Sotus. In 193, a series of councils was held in what we now know as Palestine, Pontus and Osrhoene in the east, and in Rome and in Gaul and in the west concerning Quattrodecimism. They all condemned the practice in the Roman province of Asia, where Easter was celebrated at the Passover full moon, rather than on the following Sunday. Victor, the Bishop of Rome, who presided over the Council of Rome, communicated his decision to Polycrates of Ephesus and the churches of the Roman province of Asia, asking them to convoke a council of bishops in their own province. Accordingly, they held one at Ephesus within the same year and requested a synod, which rejected Victor's demand that they change their Paschal tradition. So these smaller synods and councils weren't always definitive and didn't always have impact on the entire church and weren't universally accepted. And that's a big point regarding when we get to the discussion on the ecumenical councils and that they're generally accepted, by the whole of the Western tradition. The Synod of Elvira in southern Spain laid down common rules to be observed by all of their bishops of that area, rules almost entirely concerned with the conduct of various elements of the Christian community. And the conducts of predominantly sexual sin and falling away and succumbing to persecution and trying to come back into the church after persecution. And they, at this particular council, they put forth various censures and demands on these people. Sometimes, for long periods of times, periods of penance, often for sexual offenses, extended to 5 or 10 years. In its Canon 33, they enjoined complete continence or sexual abstinence upon all clerics, married or not, and all who minister at the altar. So this was another regional synod. The Synod of Ankara, modern Ankara, laid down rules about the penances to be performed by Christians who had lapsed during the persecutions. It allowed marriage for deacons who, before ordination, had declared their inability to remain unmarried, and it forbade clergy in other parts of their diocese who were lower ranked than the bishops of the cities to ordain deacons or priests. So they were reserving certain rights to the episcopacy. So we see here that these small regional councils, were addressing problems of church discipline, of how they are to react in certain situations, and trying to codify in their own local minds and area issues that were of concern to them. And then next we move on to what we know as the first 7 ecumenical councils. These were councils of church bishops and leaders that were gathered throughout the known church world at that time. During the Roman, the early period of the church, because of the Pax Romana, the church spread all over the known world, and there were bishops all over in various and sundry local communities, and they were being the church as a whole was being confronted by what we now know as heresies, things that are divergent from what we consider to be the orthodox rule of faith. And so the first of these councils was held in Nicaea in the year 325, and it repudiated Arianism and adopted the Nicene Creed. The First Council of Nicaea was convened by Constantine I shortly after proposing to move the capital of the empire from Old Rome to Constantinople in Byzantium, to primarily deal with the heresy of Arius, a priest in Alexandria that taught that the Son was inferior to the Father and created. The organization of the church, establishing the priority of the sees of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, with Jerusalem still in subjection to the metropolitan of Caesarea and Constantinople, not yet officially inaugurated as a capital city. And the council maintained that Christ was one with the Father, homoousios, and composed the creed that bears the name of this council to preserve the confession of Orthodox Christianity. Wow, how important is that? That we have a baseline rule of faith, and that we understand the basics. And this is what the church was confronted with. The Second Council was the First Council of Constantinople in 381, and they revised the creed at that point into the present form used in the Eastern and in many Old Catholic churches today. The Council of Constantinople expanded the Nicene Creed by adding a clause to the role of the Holy Spirit as a person of the Holy Trinity, same in essence and fully God, along with the Father and the Son, who proceeds from the Father, and with the Father and the Son is worshipped and glorified. The council also made the Bishop of Constantinople to be second in honor to that of the Old Rome, pushing Alexandria down to the third in honor, making Constantinople New Rome. So the church, over the years, struggling to define itself, to define orthodoxy, right thinking. Right? The First Council of Ephesus is the third ecumenical council, and that was held in 431. And it repudiated Nestorianism, proclaimed the Virgin Mary as the Mother of God. The Fourth Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon in 451 repudiated the Assucian doctrine of monotheism and described and delineated the two natures of Christ, human and divine, and adopted the Chalcedonian Creed. The Fifth Council, the Second Council of Constantinople in 553, reaffirmed the decisions, doctrines explicated by the previous councils and condemned new Arian, Nestorian, and Monophysite writings. See, once the church had condemned them in the previous councils, they just didn't go away. Okay, so Sorry, my screen just went blank on me. The old heresies never seem to die. Doesn't matter how much we rant and rave and teach and preach. Error seems to persist. And this is one reason why it's important for us to understand the councils of the church, so that we ourselves don't lapse into the old heresies. And unfortunately, I see a lot of this happening today in the modern church. The Third Council of Constantinople is the Sixth Ecumenical Council, held in 680 to 681, and it repudiated monothelitism, affirmed that Christ had both human and divine wills. How important is it that we understand the divine nature? God is so beyond our human intellect. Imagine, the creator of the universe, that to say that he holds the world in his hand is a vast understatement. And so throughout the ages of Christendom, the church has been struggling to understand who God is and who we are in relationship to him. And the Second Council of Nicaea is the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And it really defined how a lot of our Catholic churches operate these days. Not in a liturgical standpoint, but in the fact that, we use imagery, the cross, icons, rosaries. Images are very important to us in facilitating our worship. And the Second Council of Nicaea basically was confronting what was known as the iconoclast controversy, which was brought on, strangely enough, not by members of the church so much, but by confronting the Islamic jihadists of that age, who looked at these as graven images that we were, in somehow or another, assuming that we were worshiping the images. And then even after the Second Council was completed, and the veneration of icons was restored, it was still a number of years before the controversy was finally put to rest and accepted by the church as a whole. And this is a strong, really important point, and it's basically known as sensus fidei, which is the sense of the faithful. Are the faithful, church in the church actually accepting the teachings of these councils and the teachings that are being presented? And we have to look back at what has gone before and say, yes, these councils were accepted and put into wide practice, not necessarily overnight. Okay, in some instances it might have taken 10, 20, 50, 100 years or so for things to be brought into total acceptance and practice. And as was pointed out to me recently by an archbishop in England, that even things that happened during the Great Schism, weren't necessarily known and understood by the majority of those in Christendom until many years, and maybe even hundreds of years after the fact. It was a different world. We didn't have instant communication. We didn't have Facebook Live or online videos where we could communicate exactly what we mean to say, and then more or less assure that we are understood. Moving on, let's look at the Middle Ages. And this was a period in Europe dating from the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West around the 5th century. However, the fixing of these dates for the beginning and end of the Middle Ages seems to be arbitrary. According to the Norton Anthology, medieval social theory held that society was made up of 3 estates: nobility, which was composed of a small hereditary aristocracy, the church, whose duty was to look after the spiritual welfare of that body, and everyone else. And according to the Encarta Encyclopedia, no one definite event marks the end of antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages. By the end of the 5th century, the culmination of several long-term trends, including a severe economic dislocation and the invasions and settlement of Germanic peoples within the borders of the Western Empire, had changed the face of Europe. And for the next 300 years, Western Europe remained essentially a primitive culture, albeit one uniquely superimposed on the complex, elaborate culture of the Roman Empire, which was never entirely lost or forgotten in the Middle Ages. The only universal institution was the church. And even there, a fragmentation of authority was the rule. Virtually all power within the church hierarchy was in the hands of local bishops. There was no centralized control based in one patriarch, such as the Bishop of Rome. The church basically saw itself as the spiritual community of Christian believers in exile. In exile from God's kingdom, waiting in a hostile world for the day of deliverance. The most influential members of church society during that time was found outside of the hierarchy of the church government in the various monasteries that dotted the landscape of Europe. The Middle Ages also marked the period where the patriarchs of Rome began insisting not only on supremacy in the spiritual realm, but in the secular world as well. However, despite the rise of papal ambition, 4 ecumenical councils were held during this period, and none of them were called by a pope, nor did their petition or position command an infallible acquiescence. So moving on from there, I briefly mentioned the Great Schism a few minutes ago. As I mentioned earlier, the Middle Ages was marked by increasing demands of the Patriarch of Rome for supreme authority over all the churches in Christendom. The Roman or Western Church considered itself to be the one true church, the universal, hence Catholic Church. The church in Constantinople, Eastern, considered itself to be the correct and traditional church, hence the Orthodox Church. Now, I'm not going to give a complete overview of all the technicalities of what went on and what led up to and the political nature, etc. But basically, the issue was power and control and authority, and that was being promulgated and pushed and forced by the Bishop of Rome. And so in 1054, Pope Leo sent a legate to Constantinople, and the idea was to forced them to accept the Filoque, or the term and the Son, into their version of the Nicene Creed. And of course, from the Roman standpoint, at that point in time, there was some issues with the rise again of Arianism, and they felt justified in making this change, because they felt it was needed to strengthen the nature of God and the Holy Spirit, and more particularly the Son and his position in the Godhead. But if we do a careful look and review of the first 7 ecumenical councils, it was, for several hundred years, it was commonly understood that not even another council could change the creed, let alone a pope. And so for the churches of the East, that was what we consider, what I term a bridge too far. As a result, a representative from Pope Leo excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, and in a tit-for-tat move, it seems that that the Roman Church was excommunicated from the Eastern churches as well. And of course, the technicalities of what went on is a little bit more entailed than that. But out of that argument, out of that struggle for supremacy by the Bishop of Rome and his representatives, we see that a split occurs in the church. And so, I want to ask and pose a question that I posed before in schism. Okay, who is the true schismatic? Is it the one that wishes to stay and have fidelity, what has been taught and believed before, or is it the one that is proclaiming something new? I'll let you ruminate on that. I have my own opinions. So it's important to note that it was not until after this time, that after the Great Schism, that the popes started calling their own councils. Okay, so they were never, from that point on, truly ecumenical gatherings of the entire church, because the church had split. So moving on from this, we need to look at the 14th and 15th centuries, and particularly starting with the Avian papacy, and that was a period from 1309 to 1376, during which 7 successive popes resided in Avignon, then a kingdom of Arles, part of the Holy Roman Empire, now in France, rather than in Rome. The situation arose from a conflict between the papacy and the French crown. Following the strife between Philip IV of France and Pope Boniface VIII, and the death of his successor, Benedict XI, after 8 months in office, a deadlocked conclave elected Clement V, a Frenchman, as Pope in 1305. However, Clement declined to move to Rome, remaining in France, and in 1309 he moved his court to the papal enclave in Avignon, where he remained for the next 67 years. The absence from Rome is sometimes referred to as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. A total of 7 popes reigned at Avignon. All were French, and they all increasingly fell under the influence of the French crown. It wasn't until September 13th, 1376, that Gregory XI abandoned Avignon and moved his court back to Rome, ending the Avignon papacy. However, it doesn't get much better after that. Almost immediately following, there's something we call the Western Schism, or the Great Western Schism. And this is the period where there were 2 and later 3 rival popes, each with his own following, his own sacred college of cardinals, and his own administrative offices. Shortly after the return of the papal residents to Rome, following almost 70 years in Avignon, the Archbishop of Bari was elected as Pope Urban VI, amid demands by the Roman populace for a Roman, or at least an Italian. Urban the Sixth proved to be so hostile to the cardinals who had assumed great power during the years of Avignon that a group of cardinals retired to Angani and elected one of themselves, Robert of Geneva, as Clement VII, claiming the election of Urban VI had been invalid because it was made under fear. Clement VII then took up residence again at Avignon, although the Roman Catholic Church historians generally agree that Urban and his successors were the legitimate popes. There's never been an official pronouncement to this effect. I want to take a minute to reflect on something here, and that is the issues of politics and power that we see in play here. Particularly from the Italians and almost forcing the issue that a new pope must be Italian or Roman. So much of church power. So much of the church history is embroiled in politics. Even the ongoing councils of the churches. We look at in a later time here. We'll look at the Council of the First Vatican Council, which in my mind was one of the most politically driven and politically active council of church history. So the double election had a disastrous effect upon the church. The followers of the 2 popes were divided, chiefly along national lines, and thus the dual papacy fostered the political antagonisms of the time. The spectacle of rival popes denouncing each other produced great confusion and resulted in tremendous loss of prestige for the papacy. And if we want to, bring this back a step, if the papacy itself, the concept of the papacy and infallibility and supreme authority is valid, then which one of these popes was infallible? Which one was truly supreme? And at that time there were various proposals for ending the schism, and they were especially made by the University of Paris, which suggested either mutual resignation or a decision by an independent tribunal, or even a general council. This last proposal was in line with the growing Conciliar movement, according to which a general council has greater authority than even a pope. Both lines of popes refused to submit. Eventually, cardinals from both obediences, seeking to end the schism, arranged a council in Pisa in Italy, which met in 1409 and elected even a third pope, Alexander V, who was succeeded shortly thereafter by Baldassare Cosa, who took the name John the 23rd. Under pressure from the Emperor Sigmund, John convoked in 1414 the Council of Constance, which deposed him and received the resignation of the Roman Pope. Gregory XII and dismissed the claims of the Avignon Pope, Benedict XIII. That series of events opened the way to the election of Martin V in November of 1417, whereby the schism was ended. Wow. What a conflagration of power, control, and politics and machinations. How much of this could have been mitigated, if the conciliar model had been used? Could this eventually happen again? Could there be rival popes? And which of them would be the infallible? Which of them would be the true superior, supreme pontiff? So, as we see here, in the 14th to 19th century,